Cynthia, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Maria. Thank you very much. How are you?
I am very well, and I'm looking forward to our conversation about team dynamics, about the impact of cultural backgrounds. And I'm especially intrigued to hear your perspective as an African facilitator. So what is different? What's the same? What are the challenges?
Yeah, thank you. No, I think it's very, very nice to get to share perspectives, especially coming from Africa. I mean, Africa is wide also, it's big. So coming from some African countries, really. So it's important that we get to hear them as well.
Yes, yes, yes. And before we're getting there, I always like to start with a kind of icebreaker, warm-up question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
That's a very interesting question. I do call myself a facilitator when I am supposed to facilitate a session, right? But it's not necessarily something that I will call myself continuously. Like I wouldn't, it's now that I'm starting to identify myself as a facilitator in terms of what I do, right? Like a career path or a passion. But I don't know when I started. I always say that facilitation found me. I can't remember when it found me. I just remember that, you know, for some reason, I always convened discussions. I always moderated discussions. I think it really started though when I started my radio career and I was very young, about 19 years of age. And because of the conversations, I really loved hearing people share their perspectives. And I liked inviting other people in the conversations and giving them time to speak. I think that's where the whole thing started.
Yes, this sounds very much like facilitation.
Exactly.
So what have you learned from your time on the radio about how to manage group dynamics or how to facilitate in a space with groups?
Yeah, so I think what I learned is mainly how people really do not like to get out of their comfort zone. And if you're the person who's in charge of this conversation, then really almost the whole thing lies on you to get it going. So sometimes, because it was a commercial radio station, so obviously we'll have many guests, we'll have commercial partners, for example, people who are there to speak. But then there are other people that you invite because you need stories from them, people you want to speak to. The moment you ask them a question or the moment they see a recorder, oh my goodness, you just feel like they just, you know, they close themselves up because they're like, this person's just going to listen to me and to hear what I have to say. And oh my goodness, you know, all the imposter syndrome. So I feel like as a facilitator, it's really important to prepare the environment and to make it as safe, feel as safe as possible to get anything out of people.
Yes, this resonates very much. And I think with the podcast, it's similar. Well, it's not live, so it takes a little bit of the pressure out. That to invite someone on a live radio show, you really have to prepare the ground, create the safe space, as you said, and also onboard them. So what was your process in creating this safe environment on the radio? And is it similar or different when you create the safe space for a group?
So I think for radio, you see, for example, if you're inviting a guest or, you know, for an event or for a discussion or for a story, you take time to get to know them. Right. And I feel like this is something I have always used. Unfortunately, the time is less and less if you're working with a larger group, like what I'm doing currently. But being intentional in trying to get to know the person. So knowing the person doesn't necessarily going into their private stories and stuff, but, get to know, who they are and why are they there? What made them happy that, before they got into the studios? What made them want to come to this workshop? Why are you happy today? How has the pandemic affected you? Just take time to really connect humanly, because we are all going through things, and we always identify with a person who seems to genuinely be curious and practicing, really listening because, they want to get to know the other person. I feel like this is something I have done from the beginning, and it's surprisingly the thing I'm still doing today.
Maybe because it works. And it's so interesting what you're saying, that on the one hand, we all suffer from imposter and like, oh my goodness, I'm going to share my thoughts and my story. So this feels uncomfortable. On the other hand, as you also said, we all have the urge to speak and to be listened to because it feels so comfortable.
Yes.
So there's kind of a tension between these two things.
Yes.
That, if I understand you correctly, the goal of a facilitator, whether it's a facilitating interview on a radio show or a facilitator in the space, is to bridge this kind of gap between I want to share, but I don't dare to.
Yeah, and sort of flatten it out and make it even for that person to feel like their story is important because it's important to you who's listening. But at the same time, how do you make them feel safe enough and comfortable enough that, they're willing to bring the best, out of themselves? Yeah, that's how I see it.
Yeah.
I hope it makes sense.
It makes total sense. And I really believe that giving someone the feeling that they really truly listen to is the best way to create this safety and to get the best out of them. Yeah,
I think one of the issues that I dealt with in the past, as I was trying to grow in this kind of career, if I might say, it's really looking at how people think they are listening, but without listening. That we know we need to practice active listening, but how many of us do that? Even in our own homes, in our own, social relationships, you really listen with an intent, listen to catch a sentence, listen to, but getting to the level where you actually practice active listening, it's an amazing exercise, I think.
Yes, listening to appreciate and not listening to just reply.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what do you think is the difference of these skills of active listening and also sharing between cultures? Is it something that is cultural inherent? Because in our exploration call, you mentioned that most of the facilitation methods or concepts or tools are kind of Eurocentric or developed in the US or in the Western world, in air quotes. Do you perceive a difference when you're working on the African continent? And it feels weird to speak about the African continent, but I'm also speaking about the European and the American continent.
Yes, no, I totally get what you mean. So when we say practicing active listening, to me is you listen and sometimes you hear what is not said, right? What the things that have not been put in a verbal form. I haven't been able to say all the words, but you can feel. If you're practicing active listening, then you can feel there are things that probably I'm holding back, or there are things I have said in another form. And as you keep probing, maybe then you will end up getting, something out of someone. But I feel like practicing active listening is very, very important to understand the cultural settings you're working in. I am currently facilitating different groups, and I can, for example, tell you about one group which is made of entrepreneurs from Rwanda. And these are people who have come up with amazing ideas. They are startups. They want to do business. But at the same time, these are people who have grown up in a culture that tells them, hey, hold on, don't say everything all at once. Be careful what you're saying. You don't know who's listening. Just, don't talk just for talking. Think before. There are people who are really not quite very, very open to say exactly everything the way they feel. And it has a culture component to it. It comes with the way people have been educated. It comes basically how people have been molded, right? And if you're not aware of that, so that you give them time to process, so that you create a much safer space for them to know, hey, yeah, I know this is how we were constructed as children, but actually being an adult, it's also about learning and unlearning things, right? And this is
the
how
unlearning part is difficult.
Exactly. And this is how we're going to continue in this workshop, because we are business people. We need to talk about our businesses. We need to practice some level of vulnerability, So it's really important that you listen, that you understand the person you're talking to before you expect them to talk back or to tell you,
And would this be something that you address explicitly with the group, or is it something that somehow emerges and you have your tools to make them feel more comfortable?
Yeah, so I don't say it as outrightly like that, because at the end of the day, you don't want the people you're with to feel like, this person is overanalyzing us, the psychologists, very much, That's not what I do. But I mean, depending on the groups, really. For example, there are some groups of the same cohorts, right? Of the young people, they're very young. Most of them are Generation Z. Some of them were raised very differently from us. But if it's a group with maybe older people or people in different settings, so I will sort of say things that are more relatable to them. I wouldn't jump into the thing. I wouldn't bring icebreakers that make them feel like, oh, wow, this is too much. This is going from 0 to 100 all of a sudden, which is what the young ones like, right? So I think if you have a group that has a mixture, I usually take a few minutes, probably a day before I run the workshop, to really understand the profile of the people I will be with and say, okay, what would these people want? What do they want to hear? What kind of messaging resonates better with them? But I'm also a communications expert, so I really try to think in terms of messaging and how, words and body languages and jokes, how they work with people. So I don't really tell them, hey, listen, this is how we were raised and this is what we're going to do. No, but mainly, this is our space. We go through the same issues together. It happens that, some of us feel really shy, or we don't like to share our business issues because, maybe a neighbor is looking at us, maybe, but at the end of the day, we are business managers and we need to get this thing going. And this is how we're going to do this. Yeah.
So much to unpack. What came to my mind is, of course, this generation issue, that the younger generation, they might be more used to share their thoughts or even their face and their videos or their voice just by using social media.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a kind of generation Facebook.
Exactly.
Who grew up with, okay, I share everything and everything can be important to someone.
Yeah.
And then there's a generation pre-Facebook
yeah.
that might feel less comfortable. And then, it's interesting what you're saying about sharing issues and having this, oh, what might the neighbor say?
Yes.
In the back of the mind.
Yes.
So what is the content? And you mentioned the topic vulnerability, to share with them, okay, it is a space we need to be vulnerable with each other, because it's only there where it becomes relevant. Maybe a stupid question to start with. Can you translate the word vulnerability in your language?
So that is something else. So basically, that's why when you are trying to understand the people you're working with and their cultural background and how they feel about whatever is happening, the meaning of words is something that you should really be very, very careful about. So when we talk about vulnerability, for example, if you're speaking to a group of Rwandans, let me say, who are 60 years of age and above, and you asking them to be vulnerable, they'll look at you and say, young lady, what is happening, you know? Why are you asking me to be vulnerable and look weak in front of the people I manage and, you know, all those things. So it needs to be unpacked, because there's no one word in that specific culture that actually expresses how we hear vulnerability using the English language. So it's important that you tell them it's not about feeling weak or looking weak, but it's about being true to yourself and allowing the other person to see you. And then they'll ask you, yeah, but what does that mean when the other person sees me?
I have my camera on.
like, what do they want to see? Well, do they want to see something that can be used to make me look weak again? So it goes back to the whole thing. Because saving face, cultures are different. The same way they'll tell you some Western cultures, for example, don't like small talks, don't come and start having small talks, conversation in the elevator. Other cultures are pretty open to it, right? So others, it's unheard of that you want to look, for example, as a manager. Currently, I'm working with groups of managers. As a manager, that you want to look like you have no idea what you're talking about. But that's old age thing, right? It's okay to not to know everything as a manager. But culturally, professionally, we know it is okay, because as a manager, there are things you are there for a reason. You're there to organize people, to build teams, and and go look for the information they need, and you help them build each other, and you build a great team, right? But culturally, if you're the head, you're supposed to seem to be in control, because otherwise, if you're not in control, then how am I to trust you?
Yeah.
So the whole thing about vulnerability, you really need to unpack it to make them understand. If I know that you don't know something, it is fine, because I trust you to create an environment that will allow me to learn. I trust you that you will go and look for the information for me and bring it to me. I trust that you help me learn and navigate this situation at work. It doesn't matter if you know everything, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, at the end, they get it, but it really, really takes time, because we are training in languages that are not necessarily our mother tongue. And when you remove a language out of a people, you're taking a lot. It's very difficult to actually be awesome and innovate in a language that is not yours. So that's why you really need to be careful with the words and what they mean, and unpack them if they don't have corresponding words in those languages that you would say is their primary language.
And being aware of the different meanings of the word if you translate it.
Yes.
Because
and I think also allowing them to tell you what they think, allowing them to give you different perspectives, so that collectively you come up with something that you sort of agree on, so that you also get to create allies on the other side, the people who might get it and who might want to not necessarily influence, but they're influencing techniques, right? People who have done it before, have understood it before, have seen it before, are likely to sort of bring the group together, because, you know, one neighbor will say, oh yeah, so this is how my friend sees it, and this is how my friend on the right sees it. Okay, yeah, so I could see it like that as well, perhaps. I could give it a chance. Yeah. So I think, yeah, it doesn't have to just lie on you as the facilitator to come up with things and come up with theories. If you are facilitating a group, there is a reason why they're there, and they're experts in certain areas. So allow them to be part of the whole experience.
Yeah. And I hear two things. One is the concept of having role models. So seeing someone who's maybe similar to you, who has applied this technique or this mindset in an inspiring way, so that you can trust, oh, vulnerability, although I might be skeptical, I can see that it works.
Yeah.
And when I think vulnerability, I think of Brené Brown. Yeah. Right? Fantastic, amazing, inspiring person. And still white American woman, but still a very different context. So I can imagine that applying the concept of vulnerability to the African culture, I would be curious, are there any role models that you can refer to? And related to that, let me just ask the question before I forget. How do you prepare these managers then to go back into their organizations and help them to make their people understand what this new way of leadership is?
I think the first thing that we do is not necessarily to create role models, but using storytelling, or even using practical examples actually in their situation, where you have a manager yourself, you know, you may be middle class manager, you have your director or your CEO. What would make you feel like you want to, you know, that you don't trust them? What is it that makes you feel like you don't trust them? It's when they seem like not to listen to me. It's when they want to insist they know something and probably they don't. It's when they, you know, those things. And then you ask them, okay, so let's look at ourselves in the mirror, and as managers, what do you think our team needs from you? They need you to listen for real, like you're listening. They need you to be, you know, be empathetic. They need you to work on the organizational and the team culture, remove all the toxic traits, do this and do that. And then of course, we do have tools that we use and the practical exercise that we do. But when they go back, I always ask them, okay, so what do you want to commit to doing? Yeah. For example, is it that you want to improve your communication with your team? What does that mean? Does that mean that you speak to your team, give them a chance to speak to you, ask them if they have understood, you know, the simple things like that. And then when they go back with a commitment, the next time I see them, I always try to have really follow-up conversations when I'm sort of facilitating a certain, you know, cohort. So I always try to have follow-up conversation and ask, yes, so how did it go? Does it feel better? And people really come back and they say, hey, look, this was really amazing. It's practical, not only at work, but at home. It seems that I can listen to my wife more. And I'm like,
facilitation is a life skill.
Like, oh, really? Okay then. Some of them are pretty surprising even to me. Yeah, but that's really how I do it. I think it's more of storytelling. It's more of finding practical examples, getting to put ourselves in the actual environment that we are working in. Yeah.
Beautiful. And the picture somehow that comes to my mind is in your workshops, you allow the participants to almost remove a mask so that they can show more of themselves. So it's another of these buzzwords, authenticity, which I think is the other side of the medal of vulnerability.
Yeah, sometimes though, I've noticed in different cultures, like maybe, let me say 3, I have worked with a group of some West African gentlemen. At that time, we were working on female genital mutilation, which is a very sensitive conversation. And we were talking about male involvement in culture change. And when you look at that group and how a group of, a few other cultures in the East African region, for example, one thing that stands out pretty much when you ask them to remove the veil, it's they always relate to the level of seniority. This is how it works. So, for example, if I'm working with a group that has, for example, their managers in the group, they'll be like, I am not sure if I can do this when my manager is here. So again, when we're practicing vulnerability, that it sort of has to come from the person who is the lead, to show them it is fine to remove your veil. It is fine to be, because it's always difficult to actually be who they want to be when there is a person who seems to have power over them. And so you really need to work on that power imbalance, if I may say. But that is really in many cultures. Power imbalance has a lot to do.
Yes.
Even in the Western countries, if someone has power over you, they can make you do things or say things that you probably wouldn't say otherwise, right?
Absolutely.
So understanding the power imbalance is something that I really note a lot. But I ask them to be authentic, try as much as possible with some exercises. And I also ask them to, tell me what would stop your peers, for example, from being authentic. It doesn't mean that
so they don't speak about themselves, but about the others.
Exactly. Yeah. So what do you think? What is the reason why a Kenyan lady wouldn't, feel comfortable speaking about her business in this kind of forum, for example? What could be happening? And then we start dismantling it from there. Things like that. Yeah.
Love it. Yeah, I think power differences in the room are tricky in any culture.
Yeah.
And then obviously there are cultures that are more flat in general, and then it's easier for the facilitator to create that. And then there are other cultures where it's more steep. How do you even try to flatten the room because for instance, when I host a workshop and there is a power difference, a visible one, then I would brief the hippo, the highest paid, highest influential person, paid person, whatever in the room, and ask them to speak last, for instance, or to be the fly on the wall in the breakout sessions. Or I would do exercises where they have to implicitly show their human side. So one that I love is I would ask them, if you had a superpower, what would it be? And then to see that someone who has a lot of power still has this kind of dream of a superpower makes them human again.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with this power imbalance, and how much do you try to flatten the space?
Recently, this is a very interesting question because I was dealing with that recently. So there is a group I was facilitating, and they were pretty shy, pretty not very expressive. And So their managers decided that one of them was going to come along in the workshop and try to sort of push the group to speak. But I realized that actually that wasn't genuine. They were talking because he's there, because he's there to say, hey, you're here to learn. Come on, people, come on, but not because intrinsically they feel like they should, they should say it. So so what I did is to create smaller groups based on probably people relationships and how close they work together, or how close sometimes the groups are very different. They don't necessarily come from the same either institutions or, they're just interested in that specific subject that you're talking about. And so I try to understand who they are and how they really relate and create smaller groups, smaller conversations. I mean, Zoom, for example, with the small breakout rooms, or even when it's physical, get into smaller spaces where people who lead with different types of energy, there are people who are so expressive, for example, who really risk to take up the whole room because, I mean, they have things to say, and if no one is saying something, then they might as well take the time and say it, while others need to first calm down and really reflect. So I find creating those smaller groups very effective, because then you give everyone a chance to express themselves based on who they really are. Are there very empathetic people, or emotional people, or people who just want I always, we talk about people who lead with the black heart, these people who see danger, people who see red flags. But those are important people to listen to, right? Because these are people who tell you, hey, listen, we are going for a drive. And they'll tell you, what if our tire bursts? What if a light goes off? And then you're prepared. So we need those kind of people in our lives. And if we don't give them space to express themselves, then it's very bad. And now for the power imbalance, I always really try to avoid very much a very steep power imbalance. I wouldn't want, for example, a situation where we are discussing about the organizational culture, right? And we have the CEO and we have officers down there who are supposed to be talking about how maybe the place is toxic, how how we need to listen more, how the staff welfare needs to be better, things like that. I would want to hear them first and then have those other people have their discussion. And then once we seem to agree on some sort of, we have some basis that we agree on, then we can get together. But I personally probably need to also learn better how to manage those kind of relationships where I will be able to, let an officer bring up a situation of extreme toxicity to their CEO. I still personally am on a learning journey on how to do that.
Well, and maybe it would really be just too much also to hear for the CEO, this unfiltered critique, exactly. Basically.
Yeah.
And especially in the context, as you mentioned, where saving your face is so important. Exactly. Maybe first create something that you can communicate and understand what it is, so that also you don't want the CEO to just hear the unfiltered challenges or toxicity without anything that they can use for further action.
Exactly.
So it is a difficult situation, and it might really depend on also the openness of the CEO to listen to all of that and process.
Yeah. So we are also, I don't know much really about the Western social fabric and how they deal with the people that lead them. But I know for a fact that in some of our countries, people will tend to say, what you want to hear. So some CEOs might be there and say, yes, I want some insight from my people. I want to know how they're doing. I want to know what I can do. But the people will always be like, okay then. Are you sure? Sure. Or, and they will always serve you what they think will make you happy. So there is this whole thing we need to unpack slowly. It gets better within generations, but still it's very, very, very present. And
And I'd be curious about your experience of embodiment. Or I realized that it's easier to open up if we do something with our bodies. So dancing could be fantastic. I was just in a 1-week coaching program online. They started every session with just a disc dancing. They had a DJ and everyone was dancing behind their screens. And for Western cultures, especially I'm German, living in the Netherlands, inviting a group of people to dance behind a screen or to dance together is very weird. So this would throw them totally out of their comfort zone, right? If you don't prepare them. Whereas I remember from my time that I spent in Namibia and Burkina Faso, in South Africa, dancing is just so much part of the culture and brings everyone together. So dancing is actually, or might be, at least from my external perspective, maybe I'm naive, seem to be something that may flatten the room and bring the humanness into the space. What is your experience and how do you use this kind of inherent culture in your work?
It's really amazing the way people express themselves, right? Dancing in many of the African cultures, I mean, even Kenya or Rwanda or Uganda, is really part of our identity. We dance, but we don't necessarily dance when we are discussing serious stuff. So it's a whole different thing. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't like dancing, but if you want me to dance before we talk about that business proposal, then I'm not sure where to locate this whole thing. Like, where is it going? But it is true that if you create specific compartmentalized, moments where one thing is done and the other thing is done and other thing is done. I've seen many workshops, for example, where Pan-Africanists will first start with chanting, because we express a lot with our bodies and our hands. And we first chant, and then we're going to talk about our Pan-African agenda, right? That works, because that's the idea. But if I'm working maybe with young people, I work a lot with music. I work a lot with movement. That's if it's a physical space. I work a lot with storytelling. When it's online, it's mainly things to do with the emotions, like checking in on each other. I'll say, for example, hey Miriam, tell me what made you happy today. And then I would probably ask a few minutes before the workshop, come up with a question that's not necessarily a personal question that you want to ask to your neighbor. And people come up with very beautiful things. They'll say, I don't know, what did you eat for lunch today? Did you even eat lunch? Don't start saying, or they'll say, where do you go to work? I don't think we've met before. And then all of a sudden, everyone feels like they have had a chance to ask a stranger a question that made them very close. So for online activities, I always try to use things to do with the heart and how people feel and the emotions, because I'm not there physically to look at them and inspire them and maybe, yeah. So if I asked a few Africans to dance behind their screens, they would probably look at me and be like, Cynthia, all right, then should we remove the videos first?
Really?
No, I mean, I want to try that one. Maybe next time I'll tell you how it has gone.
Yeah, I would be curious. And
yeah.
I wonder, it might also be related to the space where you're in when you dance behind the screen, whether you're maybe in a public space, maybe you're in an open office.
Yeah.
I once asked a group to do some stretching exercise. So stretching check-in, everyone was stretching behind their camera.
Yeah.
And one was joining from a library and the other one from a train station. And they still did it.
Yeah. No, I mean, stretching is nice though.
Yeah.
Stretching is pretty nice. Stretching is fine. I see people do this.
It's easier than the dancing.
It's easier than the dance.
Maybe.
Yeah. So coming up with those things, really, I always find myself thinking and saying, hey, this is the group I have. What can I do to make them comfortable? And then just let that idea sit. And with time, a few things will come. A few ideas would come. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite exercise?
Before the workshop or during?
During the workshop?
I don't have one particular one. I do have a number of them. But I always I say I'm a conversationalist, so I really like listening to people's experience. So I create these, bowls where, they are colorful. And when you pick a certain color, you're going to tell us a story about this. And people really can be wild. For example, I create the green bowl to say, to be creative and create a story of your character. Like, imagine you are this character and you are writing a book. Give us the beginning, the middle that is very, and give us like a superb end. Sometimes I work on that with a few participants, and people go back and they keep their story. They're like, this was an amazing story. I didn't know I had it in me. So exercise like that, that have a lot to do with storytelling, that have a lot to do with drawing and writing. Yeah, those are the ones that are pretty frequent with my facilitation. Yeah.
Do you use a lot of drawing and visual facilitation in your practice, or?
Yeah, so again, recently there is a business training that I was doing, and one thing was to identify your persona, right? Like, you're starting your business, you need to know who your customer is, who's your client, what is her name, how old is she, how much money does she make, where does she live, what kind of lifestyle, right? So you need to imagine this specific person so that you're able to create specific products or services that go with them, right? And I noticed that a number of times I said, oh, now let's take our pencils, let's draw who this person is. It happened so very many times that people spend a lot of time perfecting the drawing and forgetting to add the characteristics. And I was like, oh my goodness, I need to really get better at this, because I don't mean that she should have perfect hair and perfect nail. It can even be a sticky, like how we draw a sticky figure. But I need you to tell me, I don't know, her name is Miriam or her name is Lillian, and she's 30 years old and she's in her second job, and this is her income, the characteristics. Yeah. So again, it has something to do with the way you give your communication and how clear it is and what people have been exposed to. Have they been exposed to these kind of concepts before? Or are you really asking them to draw so they go all out on the drawing?
That is so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder to what extent it also has to do with the permission to be imperfect, maybe even of the idea of a prototype. another one of these words, right?
Yeah.
So if you're doing this persona, it is basically a prototype, and it's not about the drawing. So what is your experience with participants or with the invitation to be imperfect and to fail and to make mistakes?
Yeah, so that's another lesson, I think, that I learned from there. If you're asking me to draw, do you want me to draw, or do you figuratively want me to draw? Right? And we were doing that workshop in English initially, and then we translated it, and then we kept the whole principle around drawing. But when you say drawing in say my language, which is Gushushanya, a drawing has to come up as something tangible that I can say this is a drawing. It's not just an idea. It doesn't represent it. It needs to be something. So so I think when you giving them that kind of when you're introducing that idea, then also remember to say it's okay if it's not perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. So then you are allowing them to do whatever, right? But if you don't actually say it, then they mirror what, they'll be like, what if she asked me later to show my drawing to people? And they'll be like, what did you do? How exactly? Remember to say, you don't have to share a drawing if you don't want. And also it doesn't have to be perfect. And by the way, no one will have to share their, the kind of things, which is also part of creating the safe space, because some things might be little, but they're actually important to people.
Yes.
And you need to understand the difference.
It is, I'm just fascinated about all these small details that make actually a huge difference. They're not really details anymore.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to language issues. And I think in the European continent, we're used to the fact that most of the time, English is not our mother tongue. But I think the sense of the words we're using are still quite familiar. And maybe also because of the books that we're reading and where we get these ideas from are kind of relatable. Where do you find inspiration for your facilitation practice? And to what extent do you say, oh, this is a book, it was written for the Western market, can I apply it? So do you take it with a grain of salt, or is it something?
Always take it with a grain of salt. Honestly, I feel like the more you are aware of how much content is actually not necessarily speaking to us, it's very important. I personally find it like it's a duty to sort of try and include what is of your own. So, for example, like you just said, lots of content, lots of forms of expressions, because obviously most of the content comes from the West, from the US. So then it really, by the moment it reaches us, yes, we get it. Yes, we understand it. We have gone to school, by the way. Most of us now, we speak English. But the reality is it doesn't hit sentimentally or inside as it would using our own concepts. And so you will find, for example, there is someone I was speaking to on a podcast recently, and they were telling me, do you know how easy it will be if we allowed children to go back in their farms, right? Because many African countries still have very rural areas where they're growing things, and see what the grandmother is doing, and and allow this child to play around the whole idea of innovating ways to conserve carrots or capsicums, or do you know, because that child is in their own environment, they are speaking to their grandmother, so it's easy for them to create, to create, which will be different from just having an idea of something that is happening in a lab that you're probably reading in a book or your teacher is telling you, but really it's not in your environment. You need to be extraordinary for you to be able to come up with a solution of an environment you're not in. You know, like you really need to be grounded. So I always, whenever I read some material, I always try to say, okay, so what does this mean for us? Sometimes I don't understand also, because obviously I don't have all the tools. I wish we had more literature on different things that we talk about, even on business, you know. Sometimes I keep talking about business because I run a lot of cohorts for business development, for entrepreneurs, and some of it I wish was more closer to home than it is right now. But I always try to say, okay, so is this a universal truth? Is this a global thing? Or is it purely a Western thing that is not very practical with us? I really find myself thinking about that a lot. I probably should find a way of coming up with solutions as well. But
and writing a book?
Maybe. But it's true that I feel that thing quite a lot. Yeah.
And this just brought another question to my mind. I worked in Vietnam, and there I observed that very often, and I was teaching there, but my style of teaching was already quite facilitative. Although back then I didn't know what a facilitator was. Anyway, but what I observed was that instead of looking for their own solutions or their own ideas, they had a tendency to wait for me to provide them with the information. And in a context of a lecture, this is totally fine. In the context of a workshop, this is not leading to the goal that we wish or intend, right? So what is your experience of that, of really empowering the participants to share their own ideas, experience, perspectives?
I think probably mine will be slightly different from yours, because they look at you as someone who's from the other side of the continent, and you know, she's probably from where the solutions have been have been initiated. So let her tell us what she thinks. For me, it's different, because I don't have any more solutions to give to them than what they would come up with. But what you're saying is true, because we tend to use the solutions that have been tried before, which is a good thing. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. But sometimes it's just a pick, plug and play. And sometimes it doesn't really necessarily work in our context.
For the reasons you just explained, yeah.
Exactly. So it might not that necessarily they're waiting for me to tell them, but it's just the way they have seen a certain solution working in Norway or in France or, you know, in the US, which is an amazing thing. But when you bring it back to work in your business or in your company, you need to give it some context. You need to understand what it is, you know? Yeah. So recently we were having a conversation about, you know, the way organizations today should be creating space for mothers, for example, who are breastfeeding, the creation of nurseries, the creation of, you know, things, those solutions that would help women do what they want to do with their lives without having to choose to be a stay-at-home mom or a working mother. And then someone told us, but actually, these solutions are not necessarily Western solutions, although they have tried it and some of them work. But if you go back in the African context of doing things, women in Africa always worked. A woman has always gone to do some trading, has always been in the firm, working something, growing something, going to the market. So the idea today should be, how do we make that better? How do we create better environments that allow them to explore all their potential? And because women have always worked and women have always breastfed their children until they are 3, how did that happen? What happened at that time? So that an organization that you will start today in Burkina Faso can be inspired by what we did before to make sure that, you know, a woman can still breastfeed her children and still work. And I will ask the group, you know, what do you think you were doing in Burkina Faso that is right, that can be applied today? Because if Burkina Faso tries to do it the same way France does it, they probably will not succeed. But if they go back to what they used to do, they probably would understand, because it's part of you know. So it's things like that, allowing people to you know, to draw into also what they know, what they know.
That's beautiful. And it sounds very empowering for the group to then realize, oh, we figured things out. And just because the Western people are doing stuff, we have done that before. Yeah. And then finding their own solutions from their past and from their own present.
Exactly. Or say, you know, other people have done it before us, which is good. And we are bringing it. So then how do we make it fit for us? And allowing them to think. Because just because you picked a solution in a book, it doesn't necessarily mean it will work for you. So it's really important that you try to understand how this whole thing is going to work for you. And it's beautiful when people start sharing ideas. I think that's what is empowering, even for me, when I see that I have planted a seed. It's only planting, because you can't develop the solutions for them. I just read something and I felt like, oh, well, yeah, this could be used. This is really gold. It can be used, but it can't be used in its raw form, right? So then you give it to them and you let the conversation flow. Yeah.
Beautiful. For you, what makes a workshop fail?
The environment, I think. If I don't feel safe, even me who's pre-aware, I'm not going to say anything, even to one person. So if the environment doesn't feel safe for me to express myself, I think it will be a failure, because it will. I'm still trying to learn how to manage the silence. You know, when you have people and you ask them a question and then there is this loud silence. Silence is good because it means people are processing. But then how much silence is okay? Some silence just feel uncomfortable. It's not like you've allowed people to think and they're like, oh yeah, let me reflect about what Cynthia has said and let's share. Sometimes it's just like, no, I don't feel safe here. So I feel like the environment, if it doesn't feel safe, it will make the workshop fail.
And yes, silence is such a powerful tool. And listening to the meaning of silence is maybe a superpower. Because sometimes the discomfort of silence is just in our own head.
Yes.
And sometimes it is in the room.
Yes.
And to distinguish this.
To look at it. Mm-hmm. To look at it and know where it is.
I realized that the more comfortable I feel with silence, the more comfortable also the group feels with it.
Yeah.
And then just to use this as a moment of grounding.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although especially in the online environment, it's even more difficult because we often have the urge, oh, it's silent. Is the tech working? Are you on mute? Did something happen? Did I freeze?
Have you heard? Did you hear me? Or have I been speaking to myself the whole time?
Yeah. So I think we have to be more explicit about the silence we're using as a tool when we are working online.
Yeah. I feel, yeah. Also, for me, at least with the experience I have, language can be a major failure. It's probably not necessarily something that I don't know, people in Europe or in the US might experience, but the need to use one language that is common for everyone. You know, like we go to work, we are all working in English. So even when we're learning, let's do it in English. That's a beautiful idea, but it's not necessarily always practical. For me to say that I'm running a whole workshop of, 3 hours in French, when there are people who have learned French just maybe 5 years, in their education, the whole education system, and the quality of the expression in those languages, for me, I'm really, really careful because I have seen that not necessarily working. And then there is this whole thing we need to deconstruct in our countries, in our cultures, that speaking those languages is a form of extra knowledge, right? And so if someone does not feel comfortable speaking English, they will try as much as they can to express themselves in that language so that they feel a certain sense of, they're fitting in. And I really feel sad about that sometimes because, yes, I know this is the language for the workshop, but we might go home with very little because of that. So those are some of the things I struggle with, and I feel like it's personal. I need to, find ways of doing this better. But yeah, I think those are the two things I would say about workshop failing mainly.
Yeah. And the language thing is so important. I think we spoke about that in our exploration call, me sharing that I was doing research in Burkina Faso. So it's a French-speaking country. I learned French mostly when I was a teenager and a kid. Mm-hmm. So my French is, although I don't have much of an accent, the words that I'm using are quite colloquial.
Yeah.
And what I underestimated was the different way, especially in Western Africa, they use French as a language. So they are much more polite in the words they're using. And me speaking my colloquial French, I seriously pissed off some collaborators without even wanting it. So I think even if we're using the same language, it requires a lot of empathy to then also distinguish, okay, it's not your mother tongue, and the words might still have different meanings, although we're using the same words.
Yeah, exactly. And also allowing the room or the people to know it's not a must that we keep. We are doing this for uniformity, right? But if you feel like you can't express yourself in this specific language with what you have to say or what I need to tell you, it is fine for us to work it out in a different way. But you see, that is highly, it's also, it's many other things. It's how we were raised, it's our colonial past. It's, there is this exactly the power imbalance. When you feel like you can express yourself in English, what does that mean? It's just a language, and that's what we need to get to, but we are not there yet. And yeah, I hope that with time, at least with my workshops, they get to, understand.
True. Thank you so much for bringing that up. It's I've been totally ignorant of the fact that power imbalances have such a stronger meaning in the context of colonialism.
Yeah.
Maybe even tribalism.
Yes, a lot. And so that's why you need to understand where are you, what do you have to deliver, what language, what settings, what cultural background, all that. For me, if you've done that, then it's easier than to give just the material. It will flow naturally if you've been able to work on those important aspects.
And now it makes even more sense what you said in the beginning, how you try to build a relationship to the group beforehand to understand where they're coming from, how they're feeling, what makes them happy, to learn about themselves, about them.
Exactly. Yeah. Because that's the whole thing informs how they're going to, it informs your delivery, first of all, how you package your messaging, but how they will also receive it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is totally out of your control.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What would you consider your number one facilitation challenge?
I think what we talked about on silence. I need to get better at identifying the silence and where it is. Well, it might not necessarily be silence, but when you feel like people are holding back, or when you feel like people are not necessarily engaging, is it that they're not engaging? Is it that they're not understanding? Is it that they feel probably not safe enough? Is it that they maybe are engaging and it's sinking in? I need to get better at emotionally identify. It's an emotional intelligence thing. Like you need to get better at identifying what this actually means. Yeah. I think it comes with time and with understanding people, but that is the biggest challenge, I feel.
Yeah, I hear you. One of the most challenging workshops I participated in was a workshop contributed by Dov Zal, where we didn't speak a word for 90 minutes. So it was a workshop in total silence.
What was the idea? What did you want to achieve?
So it was a test. It was part of the Never Done Before community. And the question was, can we collaborate and actually co-create a workshop design without speaking a word? And what I realized, it feels uncomfortable at times because exactly what you just said, it's difficult to interpret the silence, because even if you have 90 minutes of silence, you go through different phases and different nuances of the silence. So is it silent now because someone is struggling with a tech, or because someone is still thinking, or because maybe they went off and do something else? They're distracted. But actually this exercise helped a lot to identify the nuances and maybe to be more comfortable, because then you really have to look at the visual clues. How is someone interacting with the camera? Are they still looking? Are they looking down? Are they thinking?
Yeah. And you know what is interesting is I came to discover that many cultures actually have this. For example, in the Rwandan culture, if someone is listening to you and then as a response, they say something like, that sound has a million meanings. So I could be telling you, hey, Miriam, I think this is an amazing drawing. So would you want to tell us what it is? And I say, that could mean that I'm thinking, oh yeah, you're really being sarcastic about my drawing, huh? Or it could mean, it actually means much more than I put there. Or it could mean that sound, it's a sound that we use. It's a sound that my mother uses, my siblings use. Everyone knows what it is that means a million words. There's even a saying in that. And some cultures have different sounds, the different cues. And so if you're not aware of that, you miss a lot.
This is so interesting. Yes. It reminds me, I was in Namibia and we were doing research. We interviewed entrepreneurs. So I had a translator. And in the beginning, I was really confused because the first 10 minutes of the interview were basically an exchange of yes. It was kind of a warm up. Until today, and nobody could really explain to me what this was, but it was a kind of ritual to get into a conversation and to acknowledge each other's presence.
Exactly. So imagine that you skip all that and you want to get into the material. It definitely will not be assimilated. You will not be able to deliver it because you haven't acknowledged my presence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, communication beyond words. And which makes me think of another exercise we did with Grace where everyone spoke in their mother tongue into the camera, another of these experimental workshops. And it could actually be interesting in your context because we can learn, once we are willing to listen beyond the words, we are able to learn so much about the message just from looking at the body language and hearing the tone of voice, although we don't understand the words that are spoken.
Yeah. Yeah. But also just generally recognizing that even though we are here to learn about something specific, to discuss about this, a certain thing, that we are here from all different backgrounds and it's diverse. And it is okay to be diverse, even when we want to discuss about this thing. We can just have some rules and some regulations that will help us guide this conversation, but acknowledge that people come from different places, different spaces, different kind of understanding, education system, so much more, that we are so much more than this that we are discussing. I think it's important to acknowledge that, because when then you feel that you've been, you feel seen, then you can participate.
Yeah. Yeah, true. And being aware that being seen means different. No, I guess it always means the same thing, but we give people the impression and the feeling of being seen in different ways, depending on the culture. Yeah. Since I assume that facilitation is still a craft or a profession that is emerging in the African continent, what would be your wish for the future? And what would be your advice maybe to fellow African facilitators or those who would like to grow into that practice?
My wish is exactly that it becomes, a thing, an actual thing. It's a profession, a career path. It can be, I still find it difficult to not to identify myself as a facilitator, but to say that I do facilitation full time. If I had to make that decision, I'd really, really need to think about it a lot, because that would mean, okay, so how do I introduce myself? And when I'm sending in my proposals for a certain course, or creating packages or courses for this, what do people see me as, and how do I introduce myself to the level that they will understand really who I am and what I want to do. So I wanted to grow that it's not a mystery anymore. If I send in my proposal and say, hey, look, there is this that I'm doing, and you're welcome to be part of it and all that, facilitator, they wouldn't ask, okay, so you're facilitating? Okay, so what are you facilitating?
What are you teaching us?
Yeah. So that is my wish. Although I honestly feel like, especially with the pandemic, came very many things. People understood that it's important to have conversations, and it's important that conversations are led, and it's important that if we want to get the right result, then we have to have the right person in the room. That idea has been is being understood better and better. So the other thing that I wish to my facilitators, my fellow facilitators from the African continent, or who are in the African region in different countries, is to be sensitive to the cultural difference, or to where we get our content from, and maybe also participate, add more of how we feel, what we have learned on the internet, so that we have different resources from different places. To get to know how we also build our side of things, so that we're not left to just copy, but actually also create things that are authentic with the audience that we have, for the audience that we have.
I love that. Thank you so much for your time, for sharing your experience, your expertise. I've learned so much. And you opened my eyes to many things I've been ignorant about.
Thank you for listening, and thank you for having me. I really, really look forward to engaging with the rest of the facilitators from all over the world. We have so much to learn from each other, and it was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And I will put everything into the show notes, so that whoever wants to continue the conversation with you or wants to work with you can reach out. And maybe who want to contribute to your book.
That would be amazing. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dum, da, da, dum.